Warriors gripped their rifles the moment Tala pointed across the council fire and named the man who would become her husband, not the man her war chief had already promised her to, but a stranger who had no idea what he was about to be claimed for. The fire cracked. Nobody breathed. That single sentence would cost the cowboy his ranch, his name, and very nearly his life before the season turned. And it would cost her uncle an alliance he'd staked everything on. Watch till the end, because what happens next is not what anyone standing at that fire expected, least of all the man she chose. Autumn had turned the cottonwoods gold along the creek below the Chiricahua stronghold, and smoke from 100 fires climbed straight into a sky gone the color of a bruise at dusk. Tala stood at the edge of the firelight in a doeskin dress, worked with blue beads her mother had sewn before the fever took her, and she did not look like a woman about to upend the order of an entire people. She looked calm. She had practiced calm for 3 days, alone, in the rocks above Cord Whitfield's ranch, watching him mend fence and break horses and talk low and easy to animals that trusted him before they had any reason to. She had learned the shape of his hands, the way he favored his right knee from an old fall, the low tuneless song he hummed when he thought no one could hear him. She had learned enough in 2 days of silent watching to bet her life on a man she had never once spoken to. That was the part nobody standing around that fire understood yet, and it was the part that would matter most before the story was through. She had grown up in that camp watching the seasons turn against her people in slow, grinding ways that had nothing to do with weather. The band had once ranged across 3 river valleys, following game and grass the way their grandmothers had, but the lines on the soldiers' maps kept narrowing year after year, and every narrowing meant fewer choices for everyone, and especially fewer choices for the women, whose futures were so often traded to buy the men a little more room to breathe. Tala had watched her mother endure a marriage arranged for the same cold reasons, political, practical, entirely bloodless, and had watched that marriage cost her mother something that never fully returned. A certain brightness behind the eyes that Tala remembered from her earliest childhood, and that simply was not there anymore by the time the fever finally took her. She had promised herself, kneeling at that grave with the ground still raw and turned, that she would not let the same arithmetic be done to her without at least trying to change the numbers. She had not known, that day at the grave, what changing the numbers might look like. She had only known she would recognize the chance if it ever came. 3 weeks earlier, there had been no plan at all. There had been only a canyon and gunfire, and a war chief's niece running for her life through mesquite that tore her arms to ribbons. Tala had been riding the northern trail with her cousin's 2 children, bringing dried meat to a family camped near the spring, when 6 renegades who rode for no tribe and answered to no council cut across their path. They were the kind of men both sides disowned, Apache and white alike, outlaws, who traded in captives whenever the cattle rustling ran thin, and they had circled the children before Tala fully understood what she was seeing. She put herself between the guns and the little ones without a moment's hesitation, because that was simply what a person did, and she took a blow across the shoulder from her rifle stock that dropped her to her knees in the dirt. She remembered the sound before she remembered the pain, a single shot, flat and close, and then a voice, not loud, just certain, promising the renegades that the next round wouldn't miss. Cord Whitfield had been 3 days out from delivering a string of horses to a ranch near Wilcox, minding nobody's business but his own, when he heard children screaming in a canyon he had no reason to ride through, except that his gelding had spooked at a rattler and carried him half a mile off his trail. He came around the rocks with his rifle already up, dropped one man's hat clean off his head as a warning before anybody had time to think, and that was enough. Renegades who trade in captives rarely stayed to test a stranger's aim twice. They scattered into the scrub and were gone before the dust settled. He got down off his horse, slow the way a careful man approaches anything wounded and frightened, and found a young woman pressing a torn sleeve against her shoulder, glaring at him through the pain, as though unsure yet whether he was a different kind of danger. 2 children clung to her good arm, too frightened to make a sound. He didn't have the Apache words to ask her name, and something in her eyes warned him this wasn't a woman who wanted to be handled or fussed over. So he simply knelt, bound the wound with a strip of his own shirt, and hauled all 3 of them up onto his horse, the children in front, Tala behind, her hand fisted hard in his coat because the ground kept tilting under her, and walked the animal 4 slow miles until her people's scouts finally found them. He handed her down like she weighed nothing, touched the brim of his hat, and then, because 3 ranch hands were waiting on him a day's ride south, and because it had simply never occurred to him he'd done anything more than what any decent man would, he rode on without ever learning her name. She had never once stopped thinking about it. It was not, she would come to understand later, that she had fallen for a stranger in the space of an afternoon. She was not a foolish girl. She was 23 years old, had buried a mother, and had watched 2 of her closest friends married off to men twice their age, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with grazing rights and old debts between families. She knew precisely what it cost a woman to want something for herself in a world built by men making arrangements over her head. What she felt for the cowboy who rode on without asking her name was not romance. It was recognition. He had not hesitated over children who weren't his blood. He had not weighed what was in it for him before he acted. In a life crowded with men who calculated everything, she had met, for 4 hours, exactly one who hadn't calculated at all. She would need precisely that kind of man for what was coming. Naiche had inherited leadership of their band the hard way in a season when 3 separate bands were being pushed harder onto worse land by soldiers who kept moving the boundary lines whenever it suited them, and he carried that burden the way certain men carry grief. He was not cruel by nature. He had held Tala on his knee when she was small, had taught her to nock an arrow before she could properly walk, had wept, actually wept. The night fever took her mother along with 1/3 of the camp, that terrible winter. But the man who wept in private was not the man who now needed an alliance to survive. A rancher, 2 valleys over, a hard-land-hungry man named Colton Briggs, who ran more cattle than the water table could reasonably support, had made it plain through intermediaries that peace between his outfit and the band could be bought. Bought specifically with Tala's hand delivered to his oldest son, a sullen, heavy-fisted man of 30, who had twice been seen striking a servant girl hard enough to break her jaw. Naiche did not love the arrangement. In the private hours when no one watched his face, he hated it. But he had watched 2 other bands starve the winter. They refused every accommodation the whites demanded of them. And he had decided, in the flat, calculating way leadership sometimes required, that one woman's unhappiness weighed less on his conscience than 100 children's hunger. 3 days before the ceremony was to be set, he informed her of it, the way a man informs another of weather, because in his mind there was no version of this arrangement that involved her consent. Consent had never been part of the arithmetic he was working. Tala listened to the whole of it without her face moving, which frightened Naiche more than tears would have, because he had known her a long time and understood that stillness in her was never surrender. It was the shape she took right before she acted. She did not scream. She did not run to the elder women to plead her case, though 2 of them would have taken it up gladly, because sympathy without power changes nothing, and she understood that better than most. What she needed was a lever, something Naiche could not simply overrule with a word, because Apache custom, for all its cruelties, was also a structure of law, and law, unlike a war chief's private wishes, could sometimes be turned against the very man who relied on it. There existed a right old and rarely invoked even in her grandmother's time, belonging to a woman of standing within the band, the right to name publicly before the fire and the elders a husband of her own choosing, provided she did so before any formal betrothal contract had been spoken aloud. Once spoken, the claim could only be refused by the man himself, in front of the whole camp, at the cost of shaming the woman so completely her family's honor would never fully recover. Few men, Apache or otherwise, wanted that stain on their name for turning away a woman who had risked everything to choose him. It was a desperate door. It was also, Tala understood with the cold clarity of a person who has run out of gentler options, the only door left standing. What she required was a man who would not refuse her. Not out of love. She was not naive enough to expect a stranger to fall for a woman he'd met once, bleeding in a canyon, but out of decency. A man whose whole nature ran toward protecting whatever was placed in front of him, rather than calculating what it would cost him first. She had met exactly one man like that in her entire life. There was, of course, a simpler path available to her, or at least a path her cousins would have called simpler. She could have run, struck out alone or with the help of a sympathetic family, disappeared north or east into country where the old laws held no purchase and no war chief's reach could follow. She had turned the idea over more than once in the sleepless nights after Naiche told her his plans, and had set it aside each time, not from fear, but from a clearer-eyed calculation than her cousins would have credited her with. A woman who ran left her people, with nothing, no leverage, no lesson learned, no crack in the old machinery that had ground down her mother and would grind down the next girl unlucky enough to be useful to a man's ambitions. A woman who stayed and fought the arrangement on its own legal ground and won, left something behind her that could not simply be undone the next time some rancher came calling with an offer of peace bought in a daughter's body. She was not only trying to save herself, she was trying, in whatever small and dangerous way one woman could manage, to bend the law itself a few degrees toward something more like justice for whoever came after her. That was the calculation that sent her toward the rocks above a stranger's ranch instead of toward the open country to the north. She left camp before dawn on the second day, telling no one, and rode the 11 miles to the small spread Cord Whitfield, worked with 2 hired hands and a mortgage that kept him up more nights than he'd ever admit. She did not approach him. She found high rocks above a dry wash that gave her a clean view of the whole property, and she watched. She watched him break a young mare that had thrown every rider his hands had tried, watched him spend 2 full hours simply standing in the corral, letting the animal grow used to his presence before he ever touched a rope to her. She watched him share his midday meal with an old dog that had clearly outlived any usefulness on a working ranch, and that he kept anyway without a second thought. She watched one of his hands, a boy no older than 16, botch a job badly enough to cost the outfit half a day's work, watched Cord's shoulders tighten with the frustration of it, and then watched him swallow every word that would have humiliated the boy, choosing instead to show him, patient as stone, how to do it right. In the evening she watched him sit on his porch step with a battered guitar, singing off-key and entirely unashamed, to no audience but the dog and the dark. By the second night, cold in the rocks, she had made her decision, and it had very little to do with the dead of the canyon and everything to do with what she'd witnessed since. She was not choosing a rescuer. She was choosing a man whose character had held steady across 2 days when he believed nobody was measuring him at all, which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of evidence that ever truly mattered. The third morning, hours before the council fire was to be lit that evening, for entirely other business, she rode down from the rocks, walked into his corral in full daylight, and for the first time in her life spoke to him. He nearly dropped the rope in his hand. "You're the woman from the canyon, not a question." He'd have known that face anywhere. He had thought about it, if he was honest with himself, far more than a man delivering horses for a living had any business thinking about a stranger. In the plain, careful English her mother had insisted she learn at a mission school 2 winters running, she explained that she needed his help, that the help would cost him a single evening in a single silence, and that if he refused her, no shame would fall on him at all. She would simply ride away. She did not tell him everything, only that a marriage was being arranged against her will, that she needed that very night to name a husband of her own choosing before the elders in order to block it under the old law, and that all she asked was for him to stand beside her and say nothing when she spoke his name. Nothing more. He would owe her nothing. Afterward he could ride away the moment the fire burned down and never think of her again, and she would find some other way to survive whatever fury Naiche's plans still held for her. Cord Whitfield stood in that corral holding a lead rope, a half-broke mare pulling gently against his hand, and looked at a woman he had met once for 4 hours, 3 weeks before. He thought of how she had gripped his coat the whole 4 miles back to her people, never once making a sound, though the wound must have been agony. There was really only one answer a man built the way he was built could give. What time do I need to be there? She had gambled her whole plan on a stranger's decency, and the stranger had not disappointed her. It would not be the last time. He rode into the Chiricahua camp that evening beside her, on his own horse, wearing his one clean shirt because some instinct told him this occasion, whatever it truly was, deserved it. Right up until the moment they stopped at the edge of the firelight and every face in the camp turned toward them, he still believed he was there to witness some kind of ceremony, not to become the subject of one. Tala walked forward alone. She stopped before the fire, before the ring of elders, before Naiche seated in the place of authority, his face already darkening with suspicion. He had heard an hour earlier that his niece had ridden out at dawn and returned with a white man in tow, and though he did not yet know why, the pit of his stomach had already begun to guess. She lifted her chin the way her mother used to when facing down men who thought a widow with no sons could be pushed aside. She did not ask permission to speak. She simply spoke. She told the fire and the elders and the uncle, who was also her war chief, that she stood before them under the old right, the woman's claim to name a husband of her own choosing before any other contract could bind her, and that she named the man beside her. This rancher who had ridden 3 days out of his way for strangers, who owed him nothing, this man called Cord Whitfield. Whatever arrangement had been made for her with a stranger 2 valleys distant was now void, because her word had already been given in her own heart, in that canyon 3 weeks past, and a Chiricahua woman's word, once given, was not a thing her uncle's ambitions could simply undo. The silence that followed had weight. Warriors who had been lounging near the fire straightened without seeming to move. 2 of the elder women exchanged a look that was almost, though neither would have admitted it, a loud satisfaction. They had disliked the Briggs arrangement from the very start, and had lacked any lawful way to say so. Naiche rose slowly from his seat, and the firelight carved his face into an expression, Cord, frozen at the edge of the circle, and understanding perhaps 1 word in 5, recognized instantly, and universally anyway, the look of a man who has just been outmaneuvered and knows it down to his bones. You dare invoke the old claim. Naiche's English was deliberate now, sharpened so the cowboy would understand exactly what was happening to him. For a man who does not even know your name, Tala's answer came without a beat of hesitation. He knows my character, which is more than the man you chose for me ever troubled himself to learn. Silence again, the kind with no honorable answer waiting inside it, and every elder around that fire understood as much. Finally Naiche turned to Cord, to the stranger standing very still, with his hat crushed in both hands, sweating, despite the cold, grasping with total clarity that his life had just changed shape in some way he could not yet name, whatever the words being spoken around him actually meant. She has claimed you before. This whole camp, flat, cold, final, under our law, only you can refuse it, and if you refuse it, here, tonight, in front of everyone, you will shame her beyond anything her family can recover from. Do you refuse her? Cord looked at Tala. She did not plead with her eyes. She did not even silently beg him the way a lesser woman might have to save her. She simply stood, straight-backed, prepared, plain as day, to accept whatever answer he gave and to survive it either way. And something about that, about a woman willing to face her own ruin rather than beg, undid him more completely than any tears could have managed. He thought of the 4 miles back from the canyon, her hand fisted in his coat, no sound at all from a wound that should have had her screaming. No, 2 words, no more. I don't refuse her. The camp exhaled as one body. Naiche's jaw worked once, twice, and then he sat back down because there was nothing left within the law for him to do. Tala watched her uncle absorb a defeat he would not soon forgive, and understood, even in the relief of the moment, that the hardest part of her plan, the part that could actually get people killed, had only just begun. Around the fire, the elders began speaking among themselves in low, quick tones, and Tala caught fragments of it as the crowd slowly loosened and began to disperse into the dark, some voices approving, admiring even, the boldness of what she had done. Others plainly uneasy at the precedent a young woman had just set by outmaneuvering a war chief in front of the whole council. One of the eldest women, a widow named Chochoy, who had known Tala's mother since childhood, crossed to her before she and Cord could leave the firelight, took both of Tala's hands in her own weathered ones, and said nothing at all, only looked at her for a long moment with an expression that carried more weight than any words could have. Before releasing her and stepping back into the dark, Tala would carry that silent look with her for the rest of her life, long after the fear of that night had faded into something closer to memory. Cord, still not understanding a word of what had passed between the 2 women, simply stood by, hat still crushed in his hands, and waited for whatever came next, trusting, in a way that surprised even him, that the woman beside him knew exactly what she was doing even when he did not. It was only once they were well clear of the firelight, walking their horses side by side toward the dark trail home, that the full weight of the evening seemed to catch up with him all at once, and he let out a long breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. He admitted plainly that he had ridden into that camp expecting to stand quietly at the edge of some ceremony for an hour and ride home again, and that whatever had actually happened back there had left him with the distinct sense that his entire life had just been rerouted without so much as a warning. Tala, walking her horse beside his in the dark, allowed herself something close to a smile for the first time since dawn, and told him honestly that she was sorry for the manner of it, even if she was not sorry for the outcome, that a person rarely gets to choose the shape of the moment that changes everything, only whether to meet it standing up or running away, and that she had watched him for 2 quiet days from a stand of rocks and had bet everything she had that he was a man who would meet it standing up. He had not disappointed her. He told her, riding through the dark toward a home that was about to become considerably less lonely than it had been that morning, that he intended to keep on not disappointing her for as long as she would let him try. If you're enjoying this one, take a moment to become a channel member. There's a join button right beside the channel name, and it helps keep stories like this one coming. They rode back to his ranch in near total silence, 2 strangers now bound by a public vow neither of them had entered for the reasons custom assumed. He gave her the one spare room off the kitchen, apologized for its bareness, and spent that first night on a bedroll in the barn out of a decency so automatic he never thought to mention it as any kind of sacrifice at all. In the days that followed, they built something neither of them had a name for. Yet she rose before dawn out of long habit and had coffee going before he ever reached the kitchen, unsettling the first morning, simply expected by the 4th. She was, he learned quickly, ferociously capable. She could set a snare, track a wounded deer for 6 miles, mend a saddle better than either of his hired hands, and she did all of it with a controlled, private economy of movement that told him she had spent a lifetime making sure she needed no one's help for anything. In her experience always came with a price attached to it. He, for his part, never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. He didn't ask her to soften her English, or wear anything but what she chose, or explain herself when she disappeared for hours to sit alone by the creek. When his older hired hand, a sour, narrow man named Dale, muttered something ugly under his breath at first week, Cord fired him on the spot, no warning, no second chance, and informed the boy who remained, in a voice that ended all future discussion, that anyone under his roof who couldn't treat Mrs. Whitfield with full respect could collect their pay and ride on that same afternoon. Nobody muttered anything after that. Word of the firing reached the bunkhouses of half a dozen neighboring outfits within the week, the way anything interesting always did in a country starved for news. And Cord found himself, for the first time in his life, the subject of considerable gossip at the feed store and the saloon alike. Some of it was ugly, men who assumed the worst of an Apache woman living under a bachelor's roof, who said things behind his back they'd never have dared say to his face. Some of it, to his mild surprise, was something closer to respect, from older ranchers who remembered their own father's stories of the frontier before the fences went up, men who understood better than the younger crowd what it meant to owe your life to a stranger and to pay that debt honestly rather than quietly forgetting it once the danger passed. Cord never discussed any of it with Tala. He simply kept doing exactly what he had been doing, unbothered, because he had decided early on that other men's opinions of his household were not a currency he had any interest in spending. Tala, for her part, noticed the whispering whenever she rode into town for supplies, and found she cared about it a great deal less than she might have guessed. She had spent her whole life being watched, measured, discussed by people who had never once asked her opinion of the arrangements they were making around her. A few narrow-eyed shopkeepers in a cattle town were nothing next to that. What she noticed instead, riding home each time with the wagon loaded, was the particular quiet of the land itself, wide and gold and endless in a way the crowded camp along the creek had never quite been, and how much, to her own quiet surprise, she had begun to prefer it. It was not love, not yet, not by any definition either of them would have used in those early weeks. It was something more fragile, and in some ways more remarkable. A truce between two people who had staked enormous things on a stranger's decency, and were discovering, day by careful day, that the bet had been sound. She caught him singing badly to his dog one evening on the porch, the same as she'd watched from the rocks weeks before, and this time he noticed her noticing. And rather than stopping, embarrassed, he simply kept going, worse on purpose, until she laughed. An actual laugh, unguarded, the first he had heard from her. Something shifted quietly between them that neither one named out loud. Without announcing it, she began asking him things. What his mother had been like before she passed. Why he'd chosen this stretch of hard, unforgiving land instead of easier ground further north. Without announcing it either, he began noticing that he thought about her laugh for hours after he'd heard it, and that the ranch felt different, warmer, less like a place he was merely surviving for having her in it. Neither called it courting. Both, if pressed, would have denied it outright. But truces have a way of deepening into something else entirely when two people keep choosing, morning after morning, to stay. It could not, of course, remain that simple, because Naiche had not forgiven the fire, and a man who has lost face before his entire council rarely lets the matter rest quietly for long. 3 weeks after the claiming. At dusk, 6 riders came across Cord's northern range at a hard gallop. Naiche's own nephew, Sitting Fox, led 4 warriors, and riding uneasy at the rear, one of Colton Briggs's hired men, because it turned out the humiliation of a broken arrangement had driven Naiche into an alliance more desperate and far more dangerous. If he could not deliver her by law, his nephew intended to take her back by force, and Briggs, furious at losing the deal outright, had sent a man along to make certain the job got done. Cord heard the horses before he saw them, and had Tala inside the house with a door braced before the first rider crested the near ridge. She fought him on it. She was no stranger to a rifle, and told him plainly she would not hide while men decided her fate around her for a second time in one season. He answered just as plainly. He needed her covering the back window with the Winchester while he held the front, because that job mattered more than standing beside him to prove a point. She recognized the sense in it and took the rifle without further argument. What followed was ugly and fast. Sitting Fox called out that they had come only to take back what belonged to their band. Cord answered that Tala belonged to no one but herself, and that anyone who crossed his fence line to argue otherwise would be leaving with considerably less blood than they'd arrived with. When the Briggs man fired first, a hot panic shot that took a chip out of the porch post a foot from Cord's head, the exchange that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt to both of them like the entire length of the season compressed into one unbearable stretch of time. Cord took a graze along his ribs that would ache for a month and put 2 of the raiders' horses down without hitting a single man. Deliberate, Tala understood, watching from the back window. He was trying with everything in him not to kill anyone's kin, even while defending his own life and hers, and that restraint under fire told her more about his character than any calm evening on the porch ever could have. It was Tala's shot, finally precise and unhesitating, that took the rifle clean out of the Briggs man's hands and ended the fight before it could become a massacre. Sitting Fox, seeing the raid collapse with no honor left to salvage from it, called his men back and rode for the ridge, shouting that this was far from finished. They stood afterward in the ruined dooryard, gunsmoke thick in the cold air, both of them breathing hard, and Cord turned to her with something close to wonder on his face. "You could have let me take that shot. Why didn't you stay covered like I asked you to?" "Because you were trying not to kill my cousin." She met his eyes steadily. "And I was not going to let your mercy get you shot dead for it." He laughed, short and disbelieving, the adrenaline still loud in his blood. And then he looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself before, and understood, with the sudden clarity men sometimes get after violence, that whatever this had started as, it was no longer a truce. He had just spent 2 minutes willing to die defending a woman who was, by every legal fiction that had brought them together, no more than a stranger he'd agreed to protect out of decency. That was not decency anymore. That was something he no longer had a polite word for. "I wasn't fighting them off because of some old law. I want you to know that." His voice had gone quiet. "I wasn't thinking about any claim tonight. I was thinking about you." Tala studied him a long moment in the dying light, the rifle still loose in her hands, and something in her chest that had been braced for months, braced against her uncle's ambitions, against Briggs's cruelty, against the entire machinery of men deciding her life for her, finally carefully began to loosen. "I knew you would." He frowned, not following. "Knew I'd what?" "Fight for me. Truly fight. Not just agree to a claim out of kindness." She looked down at the porch post, splintered from the bullet that had nearly taken his life a minute earlier, and back up at him. "I watched you for 2 days before I ever spoke to you, Cord. I did not choose you because you saved me in that canyon. Any decent man might have done that on instinct, in a single afternoon, and forgotten it by supper. I chose you because I watched what you did when you believed no one was measuring you for it, and because some part of me believed that a man gentle with a half-broke horse, and patient with a foolish boy, and unashamed singing badly to an old dog, would also, if the moment ever came, stand in a doorway and take a bullet for a stranger's freedom, rather than hand her back to men who saw her as property. I did not gamble on rescue. I gambled on your character. Tonight you proved me right. If you've made it this far, the story only gets better from here. Tap join beside the channel name to become a member. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like theirs. The days after the raid were different in a way that needed no announcement between them. He no longer slept in the barn out of formal courtesy. She no longer treated her room as a temporary arrangement she might have to abandon at any hour. They worked the ranch now as partners rather than as a rescuer, and the woman he had agreed to shelter, and the hired boy, watching them move through their chores in an easy, wordless rhythm, remarked to no one in particular that he'd never once seen Mr. Racket. Whitfield laughed as much in 2 years of work as he had in the past 3 weeks alone. There was a particular evening, perhaps 10 days into the arrangement, when a sudden autumn storm rolled down off the mountains and pinned them both indoors for the better part of 2 days, rain hammering the roof hard enough that conversation over the usual chores became, for once, unavoidable. Tala mended a torn shirt by lamplight while Cord oiled tack he did not strictly need to oil, and somewhere in the second long, rain-drummed hour, the careful politeness that had governed their first 10 days together simply wore thin and fell away. She asked him, without much preamble, why a man with his obvious skill for horses hadn't gone to work some larger, wealthier outfit instead of scraping by on a mortgage spread of his own. He considered the question a long moment, turning a bridle over in his hands, before admitting that he had never much cared for taking another man's orders about how to treat an animal that trusted him, and that he'd rather go hungry some winters running his own small place right than grow fat working someone else's under rules he didn't respect. She had found, hearing that she believed him completely, and had said so. And something in the easy way she said it seemed to loosen something further in him that had been wound tight since long before she'd ever arrived. In the quiet days that followed, Cord found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul, that his mother had died when he was 9, out on a homestead 2 counties over, of a fever not unlike the one that had taken Taylor's own mother, drifting from job to job until he too was gone, leaving Cord to make his own way at 16 with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a stubborn refusal to let the hard turns of his life make him hard in return. Tala listened to all of it without offering easy comfort, which he came to understand was its own kind of gift. She simply sat with him in it, the way she sat with most things, steady and unhurried, and somehow that steadiness did more for him than sympathy ever could have. In turn, she told him about her mother's laugh, which she was beginning to fear she might someday forget the sound of, and about the small rebellions of her childhood, sneaking off to watch the men train horses, when girls were meant to be learning other things, learning to track before she'd properly learned to braid her own hair. Being scolded for it by every aunt in the camp and encouraged toward it, secretly, by her mother, who had wanted more room in the world than she herself had ever been allowed. Cord listened the way she had listened to him, without trying to fix anything, only present, only there. And there was a particular kind of intimacy in that neither of them had words for yet, but both of them had begun, quietly, to crave. But peace in that country, in that season, was rarely permanent. Both of them knew Naiche would not simply let the matter lie, not with Briggs furious over a broken deal, and a war chief's authority still bleeding from a public defeat he had not chosen and could not undo through violence a second time, not after a raid that had failed so badly. It was Tala, in the end, who rode back to face her uncle alone, because she understood something Cord, for all his courage, could never fully grasp, that this fight could not be won with rifles a second time without poisoning relations between their peoples for a generation, and that the only weapon left that might actually work was the same one she had used at the fire, the law itself, turned once more against the man trying to break it. She found Naiche alone at the edge of the camp, seated on a flat rock overlooking the valley, looking older than she remembered him, looking even at her mother's burial. "You sent Sitting Fox to nearly die for Briggs's cattle deal." No preamble. She sat beside him, though he had not invited her to, for an alliance with a man who strikes servant girls, and would have done the same to me inside a year, once the wedding no longer required him to pretend otherwise. He did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold authority from the council fire. "I buried your mother. I promised her. At that grave, I would keep you safe." He stared into the valley rather than at her. I have spent 3 years watching soldiers move our lines and watching our people go hungrier each winter, and I convinced myself that safety meant survival, and survival meant Briggs's cattle and Briggs's peace, whatever it cost any one person. Even you. Safety was never the word for what you were selling me into, Uncle. Gentler now, she recognized finally, the grief underneath the ambition, the same grief that had made him weep at her mother's grave. I am not angry that you feared for our people. I am angry that you decided my body was the currency you were allowed to spend without ever asking me first. He looked at her a long while, and something in his face, not surrender exactly, but the beginning of it, finally cracked. The cowboy, does he treat you with honor? He nearly died defending my freedom 3 weeks ago, and never once asked what it would cost him to do it. I have never in my life been offered more honor than that. Naiche was quiet a long moment, watching the valley go gold with the last of the light. When he finally spoke again, it was not a war chief speaking, but simply a tired man who had loved his sister's daughter since long before he learned to carry a burden that made loving anyone difficult. Then I will end the arrangement with Briggs and tell the council the old claim stands unchallenged, and I will not send my nephew against your husband's fences again. A pause, heavier than the words before it. I will not pretend I am glad of it, but I owe your mother better than the man I nearly let myself become. It was not forgiveness, not fully, not yet. That would take longer, seasons longer. And there would be a slow, careful rebuilding between uncle and niece that neither of them rushed. But it was an ending to the danger, which was the thing Tala had actually ridden out to secure, and she rode back to Cord's ranch as the sun went down with something in her chest she had not felt in longer than she could remember, the simple, unguarded relief of a fight finally truly over. Before she left, Naiche had one more thing to say, called after her, as she gathered her horse's reins in the gathering dark. Your mother would have done exactly what you did tonight if she had ever once believed she was allowed to. It was not quite an apology. From a man like Naiche, it was as close to one as she was ever likely to receive, and she understood, riding away, that it would have to be enough for now, and that enough could grow, given time and patience, into something more. She thought about that, the whole ride home, the valley falling into blue shadow around her, the sound of her horse's hooves, the only company on the long trail back, and by the time the lights of Cord's ranch house came into view, small and warm against the enormous dark, she found she had made a kind of peace with her uncle that surprised her. One that did not erase what he had tried to do to her, but did not need to carry the full weight of that hurt forever, either. Cord was waiting on the porch when she rode in, and she could see even from a distance the tension leave his shoulders the moment he recognized her silhouette against the dusk. It's done. She swung down from her horse. Briggs's deal is finished. Naiche won't send anyone against us again. He let out a breath he had clearly been holding since she'd left that morning, and for a moment neither of them said a word at all, simply stood together in the cooling evening, with the danger, for the first time in weeks, genuinely behind them. Tala. Something in the careful way he said her name told her this was not a question about ranch business. That first night at the fire you named me because the law needed a name, and I understood that, and I never once held it against you. The night of the raid, I told you I wasn't fighting for the law anymore. I meant every word of that. He turned to face her fully. I'm not asking you this as your husband under Apache custom, or under any paper a courthouse would recognize either for that matter. I'm asking as a man who spent 3 weeks watching you make coffee before dawn and outshoot raiders in the dark and stare down your own uncle without blinking, and who has come to understand he doesn't want any of that to end, just because the danger finally has. So I'm asking plain Tala, do you want to stay? Not because a law says you should, because you want to. She looked at him a long moment in the last of the light, at the graze wound still healing along his ribs, at the porch post still splintered where a bullet had nearly ended everything, at the hands that had gentled a wild mare with nothing but patience, and thought of the 2 days she'd spent in the rocks above his ranch. Watching a stranger prove himself worthy of a wager she hadn't been fully certain, in her most honest moments, would ever pay off. It had paid off beyond anything she had let herself hope for. She did not answer him with words at first. She walked past him into the house, into the room that had been treated by unspoken agreement as temporary since the night she first slept in it, a guest room, a stranger's room, a room a woman keeps half ready to leave, and she began, with quiet, deliberate hands, to unpack the small bundle of belongings she had carried from her uncle's camp and never fully settled into its drawers, because some careful part of her had never quite let herself believe this would last. Cord stood in the doorway and watched her fold a blue-beaded dress into a drawer that had sat empty for 3 weeks, and understood, without needing another word from her, exactly what her answer was. "I'm staying." She did not turn around, and her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "Not because I was claimed at a fire, and not because you defended me with a rifle, though I won't pretend that didn't matter. I'm staying because in 3 weeks you have never once asked me to be smaller than I am, and I have looked my whole life for a single person who wouldn't ask that of me. I found him rescuing children in a canyon, and I confirmed it watching him sing badly to a dog on a porch. I am not going anywhere, Cord Whitfield." He crossed the room, and for the first time since the night at the fire when a claim spoken by law had bound them together as strangers, he took her hand not as a husband obligated by custom, but as a man who had chosen her freely, in full knowledge of exactly who she was, capable, fierce, unwilling to be handled, and entirely his by her own will and no one else's. Ward of the marriage, real now, chosen freely on both sides rather than merely permitted by law, traveled through the valley the way most things did, and brought with it a slow trickle of visitors neither of them had expected. 2 of Tulla's younger cousins rode out that winter, simply to see for themselves the ranch their headstrong relative had claimed, and stayed 3 days longer than planned, charmed despite themselves by Cord's patient, unhurried way with horses and by the easy, unguarded way Tulla laughed now. Even Chochoy, the old widow who had said nothing and everything with a single look at the fire that first night, made the long ride out the following spring, declared the coffee passable and the fence work sound, and left without further comment, which both of them understood by then to be the highest praise the old woman was capable of offering. The ranch itself changed with them. Cord added a second room onto the house that first winter, working through the cold on evenings when the range work was done, because Tulla had mentioned once, almost offhand, that she missed having a space of her own to work leather and weave the way her mother had taught her. And he had simply started building, without telling her why, until the framing was already up. She found him at it one evening, sawdust in his hair, and did not say much of anything at all, only stood in the doorway a long moment watching him work by lamplight, before quietly fetching her own tools and holding boards steady while he nailed them, which was, between the 2 of them, its own kind of conversation. Needing no words to carry the whole of what it meant, the years that followed were not without their own hard seasons, a drought that nearly broke the herd, a long winter that tested them both, a slow and often halting peace with Naiche that had to be rebuilt one visit at a time, one shared meal at a time. Because trust between an uncle who had once tried to sell his niece's future and the niece who had outmaneuvered him could not simply be declared whole again by wanting it to be so, but it was rebuilt, in time, in the patient way most worthwhile things are. Naiche riding out each spring to see the ranch for himself, gruff and awkward at first, then less so, until the day he arrived to find a grandnephew running barefoot through Cord's cornfield, and laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in longer than Tulla could remember. Sitting Fox, for his part, never fully forgave the humiliation of that failed raid. and kept a cool distance from the ranch for years, though even he eventually could not entirely resist the pull of a cousin's happiness, and showed up one autumn unannounced, saying nothing about why he had come, and needing to say nothing at all. There was a particular afternoon 3 summers into their marriage that Tala would return to often in her memory. In the years afterward, an ordinary day, nothing dramatic about it at all, which was precisely why it stayed with her. She had been out mending the same corral fence Cord had spent that first watched afternoon, working 3 years and a lifetime ago, and looked up to see him crossing the yard toward her with their small son balanced on one hip, the boy's fists full of wildflowers. He had clearly insisted on picking despite his father's obvious skepticism about the detour. Cord set the boy down beside her, dropped a kiss against her temple without any particular ceremony, the way a man does a thing he has done 1,000 times and expects to do 1,000 more, and went back to his own work, whistling something tuneless and off-key. She had stood there a moment, flowers scattered at her feet, her son already wandering off toward the dog, and felt, with a suddenness that nearly undid her, the full weight of how far a single desperate evening at a council fire had carried her. From a woman bracing to be traded away like livestock to a woman standing in her own yard, on her own land, surrounded by a family built entirely on choices she had made herself, one after another, with her eyes wide open the whole way through. It was not a life free of hardship. Few lives in that country were. But it was hers, chosen and rechosen every ordinary morning, and there was a particular kind of freedom in that which she had never expected on the night she rode down from the rocks above a stranger's ranch to actually find. There was, too, a particular reckoning that came for Naichi himself in the years that followed. Not a punishment exactly, nothing so simple as that, but a slow, undeniable shift in how the council regarded him. The old claim Tala had invoked at the fire, dusty with disuse for a generation, found new life in the years after her marriage, cited twice more by other women of the band, facing arrangements they had not chosen, both times successfully. Both times remembered by the elders as precedent set the night the war chief's own niece stood before the fire, and would not be moved. Naichi Kult came slowly and without ever quite admitting it aloud, to understand that his niece had done more than escape an unwanted marriage that autumn. She had left a permanent crack in a wall he had once believed immovable, and however much the loss of that particular certainty had cost his pride, he found, in his quieter hours, that he was not entirely sorry for it. Colton Briggs lost more than a marriage alliance that season. Ward travels in cattle country the way it travels anywhere else, and the story of a Chiricahua woman who had outmaneuvered both a war chief and a land baron in a single autumn spread from ranch to ranch until Briggs found himself the subject of a species of quiet mockery he could never quite outrun, and within 2 years he had sold his outfit and moved on to easier country, leaving the valley in peace it had not known in a decade. As for Tala and Cord, they built the kind of life neither of them had quite dared to picture in those first uncertain weeks when a public vow spoken under desperate law. She never stopped being exactly who she was, capable, private, unwilling to be managed by any man, including the one she had chosen. He never once asked her to be less of any of it, and came over the years to understand that this was precisely why he loved her, not despite her fierceness, but entirely because of it. Neighbors who had once whispered about the arrangement came in time to speak of it differently, the way people do when a thing they doubted simply outlasts their doubt, and more than one young rancher in that valley, watching how the Whitfield place seemed to run on something steadier and warmer than most, found himself wondering aloud, at the feed store or the church social, whether he'd been wrong all along about what a good marriage was supposed to look like. Tala never much cared what conclusions they came to. She had not built her life to satisfy an audience. But Cord noticed and took a quiet, private satisfaction in watching the very people who had once muttered about his household now asking his advice half embarrassed about their own. On the anniversary of that first night at the fire, every year without fail, Cord rode out at dusk and brought back a single wildflower, whatever the season offered, and set it on the kitchen table without a word, and Tala never once let on that she noticed the ritual, though she kept every single one. Pressed flat between the pages of a Bible, she never otherwise opened. In a drawer beside the blue beaded dress, she had unpacked that first night and never packed away again. Outside, the last light drained out of the Arizona sky that first night of her staying, and the ranch that had been 3 weeks before, one man's quiet, lonely holding, settled into something neither of them had words for yet. But both of them, standing together in that doorway, had already begun, without either one saying so aloud, to call home. Before you go, consider becoming a member of the channel. The join button sits right beside the channel name, and every member helps us keep bringing frontier love stories like this one to life. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.